Hi there, and welcome to Capital Alchemy, the podcast that brings you big names in finance from South Africa and beyond. Here we chat about all things money, whether it's investments, financial planning, economics, or even a bit of politics. Our mission? To make these topics fun and easy to understand through laid-back interview-style episodes. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. We hope you learn something new. Good morning. Welcome to Capital Alchemy. Today, you are joining me, Lerato Lebitsa, your host, along with our esteemed guest, Lynette Ntuli. Lynette, can you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you so much, Lerato, for having me on the cast. My name is Lynette Ntuli. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Innate Solutions, which is a business that is predominantly based in the property real estate sector, but we do a fair amount of transaction advisory and asset management solutions for portfolio owners of various types of property, whether they're in industrial, infrastructure, retail, and so many more.
Thank you for joining us this morning. I love the fact that every time we talk about asset management, people are always automatically assuming of property asset management. But with us and the financial sector, asset management is in the management of funds.
Yes.
So the correlation between property, fund management, is it better just to be doing the actual physical asset, or would you advise that you should also be owning a fund asset as well?
I think, the two are very complementary to one another. In the financial services and in the institutional world, it's critically important that from a fund's asset management, the growth of the fund, the returns on the fund, and the environments, of course, in which a fund is able to grow, even recapitalize itself, and really also, I think, spawn other ventures from the correct management of its capital inflows and outflows is critically important. But I think on our end, what we then try to do, particularly for fund managers, is retain that value. Look at ways to augment that value, looking and holding the actual physical assets. Because, it's one thing on your world to talk about, hey, is it growing? Is it giving us the return? But who's actually looking after it, making sure that it's operating at its optimal usage, occupancy, the best possible effective use of the resource in hand. So it's a very complementary relationship that I think as property and infrastructure asset managers, we have with the financial services markets in the terms of making sure that we share and retain value.
I'm loving how you are just showing us the correlation between the two and how they are actually codependent with one another.
Absolutely.
But before we go further, because there's so many other things that I want us to debunk, let's talk about where you started, how you got into this, and where you see yourself going.
So, I realized that this is now a 20-year journey this year. And wow, time certainly does fly when you're having fun, but I think also when you're building a career in such an exciting space that has seen so many transitions over the 2 decades that I've been involved in it. I actually fell into property very much by chance. I was following a career in accounting and auditing, and it so happened that one of the clients of the firm that had sponsored my studies and had subsequently been doing a training and had training contract with, had a client who was a property asset manager in the financial services world, of course, at that particular time. And I ended up there, and whilst I was there, there was an opportunity to participate in a management development program that was also specifically looking at young graduates, young trainee managers, who wanted to grow in the space. And bear in mind, Lerato, at the time when one was starting a career, property real estate was not a career of choice. It was not something anybody ever came and spoke to you about as part of guidance at school. It was not a degree or a diploma based qualification that you could actually go to university and get. And I mean, those are now innovations that the industry has spawned and developed over time, that actually you do need to specifically train and develop a pipeline of talent that comes into the space and does not necessarily lapse into it almost by default or by chance from the other professions, whether it is legal or finance or marketing. It was not something anybody ever came and spoke to you about as part of guidance at school. It was not a degree or a diploma,
accounting,
engineering, etc. And I think a lot of people who certainly started careers in property more than 15 years ago will tell you that they fell into it from another professional path. They ended up in an entity that was managing either funds for property owners or actually managing physical assets, building them, etc. And then that is how they have since grown in this particular space and role. And for me, that story rings very, very true. You asked me the question of what does next look like? I spoke about the evolution of the industry. 15, 20 years ago, South Africa was very much focused on a lot of development. And I think we see a lot of those developments around us, and we enjoy, we live, we work, and we play amongst them. But I think now, with the evolution of everything, from just the way the world works to markets and economies, and even to the industry and the sector itself, I think it now, is looking for us as practitioners in the space to innovate. We've gone from brick and mortar, and I'm always saying we're moving from brick and mortar. We're now looking at clicks in our space in the sense of the direction technology is taking us. We've just come from the pandemic in the last 5 years, and that's completely changed the game in terms of how we occupy space, how frequently we need to occupy space, and how people are using the spaces they are in. And I mean, we've seen a situation where everybody had to be in a certain space, but then other spaces had to almost be abandoned during the concourse of that. And what we're also seeing is that a lot of businesses are looking for ways in which to optimize and really augment balance sheets in this particular economy as well, using the assets that they have. So the assets that you have may very well be a brick and mortar type of asset, but then within that, what is also beginning to expand, I think, is the definition of what infrastructure is. And you'll be very familiar, for instance, in the financial services world, for instance, with some of the changes that have happened with Section 18 of the Pension Funds Act, for instance, and how that is broadening all of our definition of what infrastructure is, what play we have in it, and what type of transactions we need to be now participating in, which meet the regulation, but more specifically also meet the investment imperatives, as well as the social shared value imperatives of a society like ours, where it's not just that we have to build commercial activity and infrastructure, but we've also got to look at social infrastructure, whether we're looking at health or education, we're looking at student accommodation, we're needing to look at so many of society's fractures, as it were, and those missing middles. And we're being catapulted into a space where we have to start to really build value and share that value socially as well. So for me, that's really the next focus area of my career as well, is where do we find the sweet spots that exist and now come from, the challenges and the fractures in a society that we have to live and operate in, and how then do we create assets of value that will also address those challenges and become unique opportunities for everybody in our value chain who gets to operate with us.
Now that we understand how you got into this and what the next is, interestingly enough, I've also seen you presenting as well, hosting at the JSC and also other different seminars and conferences within the industry.
Yes.
We've also noticed that you've been a non-executive director and a lot of things. So let's divulge into that and the spaces that you hold.
I'm a very multi-talented person. And, one of the things that definitely came from a career in property and specifically retail property was the opportunity to discuss and interact,
Yes.
particularly on public as well as specialized industry forums about what we're actually doing and creating and the value that we were generating at a point in time. And, the more I have had the opportunity to share different platforms about the work that I have done, it's almost propelled me into a space where, because our industry touches on so many diverse value chains and so many diverse industries get to interact with us, it did open a world and a space for me to speak about the intersection of so many different verticals in an industry. And I'm just a naturally curious person. So I'm the type of person who will read anything and everything and find an interest and really dig deep into the facts behind so many different industries and what's happening in business in particular. And that opened then a niche for me to first start really in the thought leadership space. But as I moved through the thought leadership space, one of the things that I've really come to enjoy as well is leading and facilitating conversations with other thought leaders about, the trends we're following, the challenges we're facing, how we fix those challenges and solve for X, as it were, in those spaces. So I've really enjoyed the ability to use that specific talent and transist it into a space that I think I've created, a lot of meaningful value for the many entities, the many individuals and other thought leaders that I have the wonderful opportunity to work with. You've also spoken about, I've served on boards as well. And that's because, ultimately the main thing for me is this career in real estate. And, the boards that I've predominantly served on, I have served, as a value-adding member who comes with the specialization in real estate, in property, in infrastructure. I also have a very keen interest, and I think that's because of the type of work we've had the opportunity to do in the area of, socially responsible investments, social impact as well through the assets that we specifically manage. So I really, really enjoy the space whereby, we can get into an entity and not only strategically, advise, have the governance oversights that so many of the boards that I have served on require, but also just the opportunity to be somebody who prompts different thoughts, asks interesting questions for, management teams and stuff to really begin to consider and bring that external view to the table that then helps us to catalyze new initiatives, rational experiments in certain spaces as well, which end up, bringing immense value to those portfolios. But also then again, just having the ability to bring what I know from the space that I'm in into a different business, a completely different business, and really provide and help, again, guide thought, guide practice, and guide value from that particular perspective.
I'm glad you touched on thought leadership. I'm glad you touched on social responsibility. So on Capital Alchemy, we always say that we'll always be discussing industry-related topics,
Yes.
but we'll also be discussing political issues and socioeconomic issues that affect us, because we cannot just be a financial silo on our own. We are part of the greater good. We also understand what happens in politics affects the markets. Let's get into that.
And talking about thought leadership, you'll often see and follow many of the posts in particular that I'll make and conversations that I'll interact in. It is our business. The nation and its workings is our business, because ultimately something as that would seem almost insignificant, like a 0.5% VAT change, will impact every single member of society. Because something as, as a staple in South African society, like bread, the price of bread shoots to another, price level. And I don't think there is a person in South Africa above and below the poverty line who does not need to consume bread in our economy. And immediately at that very, very base level of the economy and our interaction as people with the economy, it's changing lives. So absolutely the big picture of it and then the granular detail in it is something that we need to pay attention to every single decision and every single move and almost chess move in the game of, the political play around it as well, but also the game of fiscal management of, the South African purse, which, as we are now also finding out and establishing, is firstly to the greatest degree drained, is heavily burdened as well at this point in time. You've seen our debt numbers as a country as well that we're now, desperately needing to offload. And of course, I think something that will continually worry those of us who have an interface with financial services and just the financial landscape of the country is the projections around growth and just how dismally low they are. And, we can't outwork as economic players, as industries, as professionals. You cannot outwork systemic and structural deficiencies. We are all scrambling to create jobs. We are all scrambling to create, returns and value, et cetera. But the reality is at this point in time, we can't outwork those structural and systemic issues that our economy face. The moment you've got a greater discrepancy in terms of food security or something that widens the inequality gap and becomes a catalyst then of even more poverty or even more unemployment in a economy such as our own.
That's already strained.
And that's already just literally at a tipping breaking point at this point in time. Me and you can't turn a blind eye to that because it immediately then raises risk factors, whether it relates to security, social security, physical security, and just, the fabric of society does begin to change. So then how are you driving positive growth? How are you driving innovation? How are you driving so many of the big buzzwords that we use in industry to say, this is what a brighter future begins to look like, when the reality is that you're literally sitting in the dark because of those structural and societal fragilities that exist around you.
We know we've got issues with inflation. We know we've got issues with slow GDP growth. But to be honest, and everyone's always downplaying it and saying we're only less than 1% contributors to the global economy.
Yeah.
Let's be specific, and I'm very specific with numbers, especially when it comes to the global economy. It's 0.4% contributors to the global economy. That's how bad it is. People cannot stand by and say, this doesn't affect me. And I think we've had discussions about how it goes as bottom as the type of food that you eat.
Yeah.
The transportation that you're going to be taking.
Absolutely.
And with a slow growing economy with high numbers of unemployment, now we're waiting in limbo to see what's next. And we can't even wait in limbo to say whatever decision that they do make will be the right decision. It comes back to being active members, but it also affects the person right at the bottom. Because even those that have jobs or are living comfortably and have gotten their increases this year and everything else, they may think that it won't affect them. Funny enough, this morning I saw an article about how it's going to affect even homeowners. So now it comes back to, from the 1st of May, new homeowners or existing homeowners, and how even the repo rate that's now been decided it's going to stay at 7.5. And let's talk about that, especially in your world of real estate.
Yeah, I think most people woke up in the last week to emails, from your different service providers, whether it is insurance, and it's either your household insurance, your car insurance, and any other medical insurance. It's different service providers are telling you, hey, there's a VAT increase, so please expect your monthly premiums on this, that, and the next thing to change.
Increase.
Now, already, just based on that VAT increase, you can see now the additional burden, as it were, that's just placed on your monthly budget. And these are the non-variables, the things that you don't change in a year. So now how much more the variables and the moving bits and pieces, the consumable goods that you've then got to use in a home or in an office space or running a business in particular. And the thing is with something like VAT is that it's got to be passed on to someone else. And we're going to all in this chain reaction now pass it on to one another, which now creates even more burdens on your individual purse, but also I think the greater purse of the country, which then in turn it affects the issues around growth. And growth is going to be, factors like this contributor level of ours of the global economy at 0.4% when we have regressive growth, where we have, a standard of living that just cannot compete with inflation at this point in time. I think even the people who will say they have gotten increases in real terms, single digit increases, especially in this economy, which were probably 5% or less in many instances, just can't, outbox, the happenings in the economy and the space in which you've got to be a consumer, in this economy as well. So lives are also not being changed by marginal increases in salaries and that sort of thing, because then they've got to outbox these other economic factors that are also happening in your back end now, and that you can't get away from because you need these fixed and non-variable goods and services in your life in order to even help get you to work, help make sure that you stay productive and functional and an economically productive person. So we are at a very fragile point, as well. Then this is why I was saying that, we've just got to keep our eyes on the granular substance of how markets, how these policy changes, as well as what's happening in the specific industries around us. Because what's happening in financial services and what looks like growth and progress in the financial services markets looks very different if you look at our counterparts and colleagues who say play in spaces that are, for instance, heavily affected now by things like climate change and agriculture. We're looking at geopolitics and the impact of what geopolitics has on things like funding, different programs, research, and that sort of thing as well in our space. And it's suddenly now increased an influx of unemployed specialists in our economy. So if specialists in our economy are unemployed and we can't absorb them in research and development roles that are so critical to the functioning of a nation's educational health policy, sure, we definitely have a far bigger problem now. Maybe stability is something that, we will need to focus on for a while before and while, we tip the point, as it were, that will lead us to what growth eventually looks like and what it is that growth needs. And it looks like our type of growth is not the type of growth that you can just water. It's a type of growth that really needs us to go into the quality of the soil. It needs us to go into the topography of where we're farming this growth from. It needs us to go into, okay, so what are the input factors? Is it a different type of fertilizer? Do we change the tempo of the environment and the weather around this growth and what it looks? And of course, then who nurtures it? Who is responsible and accountable as well for making sure that there's an enabling environment, and in this enabling environment, all the factors that need to play, guide, and stabilize this growth continue, to stay that way, not just for a fiscal period for 1 year, but we actually need the stability to last over consecutive years in order for us to see a net result. And I think that's where sometimes, the dependency on political terms in particular to influence policy and decision making sets us on the back foot as well. Because What happens now in the current political regime is that they've got a 5-year window period. What they decide in year one may be completely different to what they've all decided as a collective, or even how that collective looks by year 3. And those decisions then impact and impinge on this enablement and the very growth and the stability that we need, which takes the country somewhere else in 5 to 10 years. So, sure, it's a really, really difficult, but a very delicate balancing act that I think we all face as stakeholders in this game, as it were.
I'm glad you're touching on who nurtures it and who implements it, because we see policies coming to be drafted, put in place, and then the implementation and the nurturing aspect don't fall into place. I mean, I boldly say that I work for Capital International. It's headquartered in the Isle of Man. And we know as a jurisdiction, as a very strong political jurisdiction. But then we also say that they've had a parliament that's been up and running for over 1,000 years. And therefore, that shows that they've been having stability of nurturing, implementation, and growth. So we need to also look on our side of the world and say, we need financial growth. But first, as you said, we first need to look at stability.
Yeah.
And how we enhance the stability and how we nurture the stability. And then once we know that this is stable and it's working, then how do we grow? The odd thing, though, is that with this VAT discussion that's been up and running, I think they put in, to me, it was a comic relief when they said non-VAT food. And we touched upon this, that if you look at the non-VAT food, how many households can even afford those? Because a lot of families, instead of going for brown bread, would go for white bread because it's probably cheaper. So you mentioned it also goes back up into education.
I like the point you started with, is that, you know, one of the things that we've also, in the same conversation we're having about South Africa and what it is that we're building here, we've also got to remember we're a young country. 30 years against 1,000 years is really nothing in terms of how old we are in the games that we're now having to play. But it means that we've got a very steep learning curve, and we've got to be far more agile and responsive, you know, to the factors that are at play, and learning very quickly on the fly from particularly stable markets in terms of what, you know, improvements and what policy have they put in place that then allows them, you know, to then foster growth in the ways that they have. And I think for us, you know, there's just very little time for us to experiment. We've got to go very quickly to what works and then execute on it. And like you say, execution is always going to be one of the biggest difficulties that we have almost wrapped ourselves on the red tape of not being able to deliver. And that's something that we've got to unfurl ourselves from a society, because in the non-execution of the priorities, we continue then to burden the very society that we should be sharing value and creating value for. And it's interesting that you've touched on the South African basket, as it were. And the more we don't stabilize, the more we create these burdensome, you know, bureaucracies and disparities in our society. It reflects on that basket that you're talking to and on, you know, and what's in that basket and who has access to that basket and what do they get out of that basket. And if that basket continues to shrink as it has, you know, the list of non-vatable items, and how, if you look at what it was in that basket 10 years ago, vis-a-vis to now, we should be in a space and in a state that has improved lives and the quality of lives just based on that. And for the first time, what research is beginning to show us is that just on the basis of food security, South Africa is regressing. And that's scary. And that is scary. And that regression and what that regression means on just the development of the same population that you need to draw a labor force from, you know, a productive labor force from, and the same population that we're creating the stability from, that is in an unstable environment, an unstable environment now, just from the basis of food security, right, is something that we need to stay worried about and vigilant on. And, if it goes back to the granular details, when they say the devil is in the detail,
It is.
these are the moments that they're talking about. It's wonderful and great that we can play with the numbers and the percentage points of this, that, and the next thing. But the reality of the beast, like you're saying, is we have got to look at who is consuming white bread. For what reasons? Do they still have access to it? Do they have access to the full loaf, or is it now 2/3 of the loaf? And what then becomes the iterative result of that access, right? And use and production, et cetera, and how does that then actually tamper with, stability and all the forces of stability that will then help us to either foster growth or will impede growth, at whatever interface we want to look at those numbers from.
This is interesting, and I could actually be sitting here and debunking this further. And I just want to rally this back into my world, because today I woke up and the rand had opened up at 18.54 to the dollar. Something that we had started thinking that is now coming to find stability. And I know a lot of people are going to say, yes, it's external factors are also contributing factors. But we also can't ignore the fact that internal factors are also contributing factors. We are part of a global economy, but it is very worrisome when at one point, I think 2-3 years ago, I was advising people to say, take your money offshore right now. It's 16.20. Now I'm saying fair value is anything between 18 Rand and 19 Rand. And people will hold on to their funds and say, no, it's going to rally back, it's going to rally back. But we've noticed over the past 18 months that as long as it's within the 18 mark, give yourself that offshore exposure.
Geez, South Africa, for its size, is a sizable geopolitical player. And I think that has, it's a credit to our country. But I think sometimes in, the space particular of ourselves as a geopolitical player, we then take our eyes off the steering wheel of the internal factors, right? And, we do have these global ambitions. And I think South Africa is always, it has always been, almost the anchor of the global South, as it were, whether it's from a policy perspective, its historical context, and so many, and its contributor to particularly the commodities markets around the world. When you look at just how important South Africa is to, as an input contributor from raw materials, et cetera, to so many economies around the world. So for our size, we definitely have to keep punching above our weight. We always have, we always will. But I think we've got to balance our influence as well as some of our focus as well, to what will keep us in the position of being this dynamite in this small package from that global perspective. I think what we're also seeing, with what's happening with the major powers around the world, is what is becoming a more insular and a more internalized view on their own affairs. And I think for us, we're still trying to play as that externally pointed player in these factors, when everybody else is actually saying, can everybody just give it a year or two, where everybody just looks at who are we, what space do we occupy, where do we want to play, and how do we want to relate with the rest of the world. And I think we can actually take a leaf out of that book, because we just also have so much of our own going on. And, when you're playing with and in amongst an economy right now that's also just dealing with its own issues and things, you're actually probably not talking to very focused nations and economies at the table, because everybody's looking in. And so I think we've also got to take that into account and start saying, or maybe let's go back to our own basics as well, and put a greater focus and a greater, investment in getting our own fundamentals right, so that when we also get to a point, because I know we will get to a point where we are geopolitically will turn again. I think this is very much a seasonal dynamic based on everything from leadership in many of the democracies and the different changes that have happened, particularly in the last, if you consider the last 18 months, how much of the world has gone to the polls and voted. More than 60% of the world's population voted in 2024.
Last year, yes.
So you need to then consider what that then shifts in terms of leadership, in terms of policy in particular. So for
trade
us,
agreements and everything else.
Who are your friends and who are your foes? We're seeing it, we're living in it. So for us, I think we need to also be balanced then with those changes happening in internal dynamics in so many of our trading partners and so many of those geopolitical spaces, and in that in international community. Maybe it's not a bad idea for us to go back and focus on our basics and our fundamentals as well, and take an internal view, so that when it is time for the shift again, and the great shift will happen as it always does in its different cycles. So when it happens again, it finds us also internally strong and sure-footed about who we are, what our policies are, where we do and we don't want to play, what the priorities are, in order for us then to go back and engage at what that seasonal change will then present to us at that point in time. So I think, the rallying points and how those goalposts have changed in comparison, I think, to other markets in the world right now, the fact that we can take a view at that fair value view and keep it relatively as stable as we've been able to for this year and probably moving into the next year, whilst we're also saying, the following forecasts, for better and for worse, will stay steady, means that we're probably in a better off position to go back to our fundamentals, get those right, and build upon them, so that as and when things externally and around us begin to shift again, they find us steady and steady on our own feet before we then go participate in the games that will be played globally as well.
Thank you so much for taking the time to come and have a chat with us. I could sit here and debunk a whole lot of discussions with you.
And thank you, Lerato, for having me. And I really just hope that your audience in particular enjoys this conversation and it catalyzes different thoughts for each of us in the spaces that we occupy and the circles of influence that we have, that, we may also just be focused on our own internal dynamics, our industry dynamics, but, what happens to a nation is all of our business. And active citizenry doesn't just mean being socially conscious, it also means being economically conscious and politically conscious, culturally conscious, and conscious in all of the ways that the fabric of the society we find ourselves in is moving, operating, needs us to enable and nurture it, but also needs us to be cognizant of what the fragilities are, because we are very much the people who will be responsible for the change, who will be responsible for the strengthening, the capacitating, as well as the stabilizing and the sustainability of what it is that we currently have. This is home, it's what we have, it's what we love. So, we've got to show it, love, in those spaces as well, because then that is where growth is going to come from, and where, the futures we're building are ultimately going to be drawn from as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lerato.
If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, press subscribe to make sure you don't miss another minute of Capital Alchemy. See you next time.